to you and morning to others. My name is Larissa Kaufman, and I'm the Director of the National Alliance for Safe Housing. I'll be today's moderator, and thank you all so much for joining us, and welcome to the webinar. The title for this webinar is the Coordinated Entry Spotlight Series, and today we are spotlighting Texas. So some of you have joined us for other Coordinated Entry Series webinars or deep dives. These, and if this is your first, so this is new information for you, these have been hosted by the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. The Consortium Technical Assistance Team includes the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, National Network to End Domestic Violence, Collaborative Solutions, and the National Alliance for Safe Housing, NASH. We'll share more information regarding the consortium towards the end of the webinar today. I want to go ahead and welcome our colleagues and your presenters from Texas. And I want to just say thank you so much for sharing the incredible work that you all are doing in Texas. We are so excited to spotlight all the work that you're doing there and hopefully provide other communities around the country with ideas, ways to collaborate, and how to really enhance practice and services and support for survivors seeking housing or currently in housing. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a little information about your presenters today. First, we have Sophia Cheka. She's the Continuum of Care Assistant Director and is responsible for assisting in the oversight of the Texas Balance of State CoCs, which covers 215 counties in Texas. She fundamentally believes that making homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring is possible, and her work is guided by that belief. Then we have Molly Boyles, who's the Public Policy Manager at the Texas Council on Family Violence. She's worked at the Coalition for 11 years. In her position, she provides technical assistance and training across the state on family violence program policy issues with a focus on supporting survivor-centered service models. She also works on systemic efforts to examine the intersection of homelessness and domestic violence and currently serves on the Texas Interagency Council on Homelessness. We also have Alexandra Cantrell, who's the policy coordinator at the Texas Council on Family Violence, and in her role, she provides technical assistance and training to family violence service providers across the state relating to policy issues, programmatic advocacy, and data management. Before I pass it over, I also want to introduce my colleague on the technical assistance team, Emily Reamer, who is going to join me in providing y'all with some resources towards the end of the webinar. And I also want to say, because this question comes up all the time, yes, you will be getting the information, the presentation from today, the PowerPoint slides. We will be sending the closed captioning transcript and also a video, the recording, out to you all, so you will have access to it. And that said, I think I'm done with my part, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our fabulous presenters today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is Molly Boyles with the Texas Council on Family Violence, and we appreciate those amazing introductions and getting to be a part of this series that we have gotten to watch in many other iterations. So we really do enjoy being here today. Along with the kind of introduction that was just offered, I have been here for 11 years, but prior to that, my work was in housing programs within the framework of domestic violence. So I had the opportunity to work at a program in an urban area focused on collaborative housing solutions using kind of what now we might even call rapid rehousing, but tenant-based rental assistance. And then prior to that, I got to work in a smaller town in a transitional housing funded by HUD. So it's really an opportunity at this point for me to work at the state coalition level. Before I turn it to Alex to offer a little bit more about her, just so y'all know, even though the name sounds quite official, the Texas Council on Family Violence is the state domestic violence coalition here in Texas. You'll see on the screen our mission, and overall, Alexandra and I are on the policy team. So we are privileged to get to look at how to create enhanced opportunities for survivors within our statutory framework. But because Texas only goes into session every 2 years, we also have a great opportunity to look at implementation and regulatory framework and how we can join together with other great systems to just continue to look at supporting survivors. And I think hopefully today we'll be able to go over some of those pieces. Alex, you want to offer a little bit more before we turn it over to Sophia?
Sure. Hello, everyone. As you already know, my name is Alexandra Cantrell. I'm on the policy team with Molly at Texas Council on Family Violence. Prior to joining Texas Council on Family Violence, I worked at a rural program in Texas. I worked briefly at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, as well as practice law in California and New York. So I am very excited to be here with so many of you today, and we appreciate you joining us.
Sophia, do you want to add a little bit more about your role?
I would love to. Thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, y'all. This is Sophia, Assistant Director of the CoC at Texas Homeless Network. I also want to echo the thank you that Molly said earlier. Molly, thank you. Molly and Alexandra, thank you for thinking of me when you were approached about this webinar. And I also want to thank the Safe Housing Partnership for offering this series as well. I think something that's important for you all to know is prior to moving into the assistant director role, I was the systems change coordinator in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. So for the last 4 years, I was responsible for implementing coordinated entry, or you'll hear me call it CE, across the Balance of State. I'll be calling that TX BoS CoC sometimes. As has been mentioned, I work at Texas Homeless Network. We work with all continuums of care in Texas, and we'll talk about it later, but there are 11 in the state. And so we provide 2 responsibilities. One is we do the statewide initiatives where we do a conference. We work with the continuums of care on all kinds of advocacy things, such as the advocacy that was needed after Hurricane Harvey hit last year. In addition to that, we have a very big responsibility as the lead agency and also the HMIS lead for the Homeless Management Information System lead for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. If I throw out any acronyms during this that y'all don't know, please call me out. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is the role of the Balance of State in coordinated entry and how we've incorporated survivors in our work. Molly, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Sophia. So just for folks who like an overview, we know every state is unique. We absolutely acknowledge that. Today we are going to talk about how Texas has a number of unique features that make planning and coordinated entry a challenge, especially for the Balance of State and a statewide entity like TCFV. I think we are hoping to also spend some time where there was success, and really for us, we've identified that nearly always hinges on where there were shared goals or cross-agency collaboration and coordination. And of course, because this is a spotlight on coordinated entry, we want to discuss that process. And for the purpose of this spotlight, we're actually going to spend most of our time talking about a certain feature within the Balance of State system, and that's the intersection of confidentiality and what are kind of often called by name or master lists for housing in a large geographic area. So that's kind of our hope for today. And again, I think just encouraging questions, as was mentioned earlier.
We really wanted to start with a disclaimer that we have a lot of work to do, and we'll get into this a little bit later or at the end of our presentation. We by no means have everything figured out, but I think when it comes to our by name list and this intersection of confidentiality and privacy with coordinated entry, I think we have the starting of having it figured out. I think the important thing for everybody to remember as you're listening to us today is that we started somewhere. So we saw what was being done to incorporate survivors into coordinated entry, and we adapted it for our needs while always keeping privacy and confidentiality concerns at the forefront of our minds. So this what we've done in respect to survivors and incorporating them in privacy and confidentiality into coordinated entry is very much in line with the spirit of systems change that we are all embarking on with coordinated entry.
Yes, and we know that kind of as guidance evolves, so will our work and our understanding of what survivors need. All of this will continue to evolve. So just to start with, as Sophia said, there is a lot of work to do to fully support coordinated entry in general, and specifically, of course, for survivors. We know every state has, like I said, unique attributes. I think in Texas, one of the things we need to start with is that we, because we are Texas and like to be unique, really unique, have the most counties of any state at 254. These counties can range from places like Dallas or Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, to fairly small rural counties out in West Texas, East Texas, like Glasscock, that will have under 5,000 residents. We also know, because we are number 2 in land mass, these counties can either be really close together. So a great example is the Central Texas region has a number of counties together. Travis and Williamson County, for example, here in Austin, Texas, and Round Rock are about 10 minutes apart, ranging to 20 at varying places, whereas some counties can be hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. With that in mind, we are also number 2 in population, and we have the highest growth of any state. So our population has been exploding for a number of years. And so I think when you pair that vast area and 254 counties that all have local governments and norms and a huge growth pattern, when you think about adding that to embarking on system coordination, it can be quite a challenge. And so for coordinated entry, that's something we're continually needing to assess. We also have over 100 victim service providers in Texas, and they are across the state. This means networking with those amazing victim service providers, some of whom I see on this webinar today, and we're excited to see those names. And we do this in conjunction with our partners with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. It's an important note of clarification that for us, we are a standalone domestic violence coalition, which means we get to partner with those great experts when we're looking at the full breadth of victim services in Texas. And we do that not only around coordinated entry, but also standing with them around comparable databases. Some of those 100 programs serve one county with a dense population, and so an example of those would be the programs that are currently offering great services in San Antonio or Austin, and some have a few programs offering services in different areas of the county. For example, Houston, Texas, there are a number of providers who are strategically located throughout the city and county of Harris. Other programs serve up to 14 counties and hundreds of miles in West Texas and, again, East Texas along the Texas-Mexico border. And I think for those that do sit along the Texas-Mexico border, you have an additional dimension to service provision that must be considered. So I think when you look at Texas, it's hard to think of any one size that will fit, because you're looking at almost 5, 6, 7 very different geographic areas across the state. We also know, and y'all are seeing this graph on the screen, that for survivors experiencing homelessness or in need of an emergency shelter, Texas is frankly facing really huge capacity issues that are highlighting even more the need for us to coordinate across systems. The chart on the left, the blue chart that y'all are seeing on your screen, is the average number of days of service in Texas. These service days can range from a counseling session to a shelter night, and you'll see that in the 4 years since 2013, there has been a really significant increase in this metric. We're seeing that between FY13, fiscal year 13, and fiscal year 17, that the amazing programs across our state are offering more than 150,000 additional days of service, or approximately that. This indicates that the programs are doing amazing work and offering even more support than they ever have before. This also indicates survivors may be staying in shelter for longer periods of time than before. On the right, you'll have the other graph highlighted in kind of gray-black. At the same time in Texas, we also continually assess when programs are full or at capacity and unable to provide shelter solely due to that reason. Some programs set policies where they offer service only when there is a bed available to enhance the survivor's stay, while others stretch their best to try to serve everyone who calls using sleeping bags, cots, and other available beds. No one of those is the right answer. We know programs are doing the best in their communities to figure out that need. The graph on the right shows that in just 7 years, we have sadly doubled the number of survivors who were denied space solely because the shelter was full. So I think what was already an alarming statistic at 21% in fiscal year 11 is now 41% in fiscal year 17. That means that close to 1 out of every 2 survivors who take the really hard step to call a program in Texas are going to have to wait to seek shelter services or work to get support elsewhere. These are calls that I think for anyone who is or has worked in a victim service program are the worst calls to have to take. I think nobody wants to have to say no simply because there's no place left. As a state, we have been really assessing these numbers because we know the number on the right should be 0. We know that that should be the only right number for a survivor calling. But we also know that one of the key factors for why we're seeing this significant uptick in the number of days, as well as a significant uptick in the number of those denied, is housing. And it's affordable housing, and it's safe, stable, affordable housing in the community of your choosing. If those days are going up and the denied due to lack of space is going up, it's a pretty clear indication that, among other things for sure, that housing is not going to be always available for a survivor to transition. We know that the correlation between the addition and number of days served and those denied can be linked for many survivors directly to the housing or to the factors that support housing and economic independence, such as employment, child care, and additional economic support. I think, Sophia, do you want to talk a little bit about how that looks on the housing side?
Yes, I would love to. I need to remember to unmute myself. So Continuum of Care are planning entities responsible for preventing and ending homelessness in a specific jurisdiction. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that there are 11 continuums of care in Texas, and this is relatively few compared to other large states. So for example, California has 43 and they only have 58 counties, and Florida has 27 and they only have 67 counties. So the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care is the largest CoC in Texas, and I believe it maybe is the second largest in the country. Alaska may be slightly or maybe bigger than ours. But as I've said multiple times, it covers 215 counties or 85% of the state. And so as a continuum of care, we are a lead agency. So what that means is that when HUD releases the Continuum of Care program notification of funding availability, we are leading that local competition, gathering all the materials necessary to send a complete application to HUD for scoring or for a national competition. We're also the HMIS or Homeless Management Information System lead for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. We use Client Track. They're one of several vendors in the country. Again, we cover 215 counties. Of Texas is 254. We mentioned that a lot just due to the fact that because we're so large, we have a mix of rural, urban, and suburban communities that we're working with, but it also means that we have capacity issues across all of those communities. So as you can see here, among our counties, we only have 20 CoC program funded projects. 8 of them are for permanent housing for rapid rehousing projects, and 12 are for permanent housing for permanent supportive housing projects. We also received quite a bit of Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG, program funding through either entitlement or through a competition through the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, or TDHCA. But what we see across the state is that there are huge spots where there is no housing. Some other fun facts about the balance of state is there are 40 consolidated plan jurisdictions within our geography. So these state and local jurisdictions are required to consult with us during the development of their annual action plans and their CAPERs. And that there are also 397 public housing authorities in Texas, and 378, or 96% of them, are in the balance of state. What we have found is that while there's a huge vacuum of permanent housing projects throughout the state, most often than not, communities across the balance of state will have an emergency shelter, and oftentimes those are domestic violence shelters. So domestic violence shelters in those areas wear various hats. Also, our offices, the THM's offices, are located in Austin, so we rely very heavily on local homeless coalitions. There are about 26 across the balance of state. It does not cover our geography, and that's something that we are going to have to work on. But we work really closely with local leaders to get an idea of what the gaps are in their community and how the policy that we set at the CoC level can be utilized at the local level as well. Another thing that's important about Texas, and I think this applies to every state, is that no state has an adequate supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters. So Texas is one of 12 states with 30 or fewer affordable and available rental homes per 100 extremely low income renter households. HUD defines cost-burdened families as those who pay more than 30% of their income for housing and may have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. Severe rent burden is defined as paying more than 50% of one's income on rent. On the next slide, I'll show you guys the rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing interventions that we collect on our housing inventory count every year. The tie-in is really important in that we are, actually, I'm just going to move to that slide. You'll see on the right-hand side. So rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, well, rapid rehousing in particular uses local housing stock in order to house individuals. Permanent supportive housing also can if you're providing scattered housing. And so due to lack of affordable housing, it often is very difficult for local programs to find apartments that participants can live in. You'll also see here that on our housing inventory count that these programs are at or near full capacity, which is also really important. So on the left-hand side, there's a chart that shows, and I'm sorry the font is so small, but there's a chart that shows housing intervention as determined by the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, or the Family Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, also known as the VI-SPDAT and SEI-SPDAT. So this graph is showing you on the left-hand side, the people that score, the 921 people that score for no housing intervention. So what that means is that either through diversion or minimal interventions, they could most likely get back on their feet. The middle is transitional housing or rapid rehousing. So 2,408 individuals were assessed and shown that to score between or for transitional housing or rapid rehousing. And on the housing inventory count, we only had 1,929 units or beds. So we're showing that there is a gap between what we have available and the people that need it. I think another important thing to mention as we're looking at this data is that even though these projects are at or near full capacity, it doesn't mean that, so they may have been so prior to people having been assessed for coordinated entry. So we're seeing, using the CI-SPDAT and SEI-SPDAT data, we're seeing really huge gaps between the people who need the intervention and the intervention that's available. Another thing I want to point out about this slide is it also doesn't look at like regional variances. For example, we have one community that has a lot of PSH, and they have a lot of people that score for needing PSH, but they have it slightly more readily available because it's an intervention actually available in their community. However, we have another community that doesn't have any permanent supportive housing, and they're scoring for they have a lot of people that are scoring for that intervention. So I think that's why it's important to think about the fact that we have a variation in what's available across the balance of state. Another thing to think about is year after year, Texas has had the nation's largest annual state population growth. So, right, everything's bigger in Texas, including our population growth. So that has led to a lot of significant affordability issues in Texas. And then you add on Hurricane Harvey, which made landfall August 25th of last year. It impacted 39 counties in Texas, 26 of which were in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. The floods inundated hundreds of thousands of structures, and it's estimated through the Department of Public Safety that 194,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. I think that might be a little bit low. Houston just recently released something that indicated that about 122,000 homes were damaged and almost 1,000 homes destroyed in their 3-county area. They also reported a lot of damage, over 1,000 affordable housing units in its inventory. And we also actually saw that in Port Arthur when we did an on-site visit after Hurricane Harvey. The floods that happened as a result of the heavy rains that happened in Houston just gutted the affordable housing available in Port Arthur.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to some of those recent challenges, specifically with Hurricane Harvey. Just recently, the Coalition for the Homeless announced the results for their point-in-time count that took place January 23rd to the 25th of 2018 for the Houston community and surrounding areas, and almost 20% of unsheltered homeless individuals that were part of this point-in-time count reported that they became homeless as a result of Hurricane Harvey. So we know that's a really large number that were affected based on Harvey. So another unique challenge that Sophia had mentioned already is our population growth. And some more stats for you. According to the U.S. Census, 6 of the top 10 largest gaining counties in America are located in Texas. For example, between July 2016 and July 2017, Dallas picked up almost 150,000 new residents, making it the largest population growth of any metro area in the country. So in addition, in Comal County, which is a smaller county between Austin and San Antonio, there was a 5% increase in population over that same time period. So we know that the resources are already scarce, and with population growth year after year, that means less resources, as Sophia mentioned, as well as less affordable housing options in Texas cities. Another topic that's important to touch on relates to HUD data collection. So about 90 programs, family violence and sexual assault agencies across Texas utilize Osmium, which is a client management database used for data collection and reporting. Texas Council on Family Violence provides Osmium-related support to these agencies and works closely with Osmium to update the system and inform agencies of updates when necessary. On their end, Osmium participates in the HUD comparable database conference calls, and they're able to make all of those federal changes that are necessary for HUD reporting for those agencies that are utilizing the system. Most of the time, that is at no cost to the coalition or to agencies. There could potentially be nominal costs to agencies if those changes required a new reporting mechanism, specifically like that recent SAGE update. With Osmium being one of the main comparable databases used in Texas, And because TCFV has a role as a support to the agencies that utilize that database, we were able to be designated as a quasi-HMIS lead. And that designation allows for us to receive important HMIS-related updates and address them in a timely manner, as well as be able to provide that information to agencies who are utilizing the OSNIAM system. And then finally, we work really closely with OSNIAM to determine what problems have arose relating to reporting and make sure to address them as quickly as possible so that programs are the least affected by it, that we can make sure that they are. TCFV has also put a lot of thought into our supported database relating to the privacy of clients' data and VAWA and FIPSA confidentiality regulations. So we have customized a template OSNIAM layout that is available for download by agencies using OSNIAM. We made sure that the template layout meets the HUD comparable database requirements, as well as other state and federal reporting needs, so that programs are able to utilize the system for all the reporting that they're needing to provide to their funders. Each agency database is stored locally on their own internal server, and it's not accessible by OSNIAM, by Texas Council on Family Violence, or any other third party. In order to provide support to agencies using OSNIAM, Texas Council on Family Violence has a test database that we have put fake data into so that we can use that to identify and correct any issues that arise, as well as walk agencies through questions step by step without having any access to agency personally identifying information within their database. And then finally, when updates are available, so when changes need to be made to that template layout based on any HUD changes or any other state or federal reporting changes, they're pushed out to the databases at each agency via files that can be imported by that agency locally. So again, neither OSNIAM or TCFV has any access to those agency systems at any point to ensure VAWA and FIPSA compliance.
So with all that framework about how special Texas is in mind, I think you can see why sharing goals with our partners in housing, such as Sophia and the Balance of State CoC, is critical. We know that when you can identify shared goals and work together to coordinate, it's absolutely the first step in any partnership, but certainly for coordinated entry and the hopes that are behind that process. We also have learned over the years what unique expertise points we each bring to the table, and that working across systems is really truly in alignment with HUD's idea about coordinated entry. Sophia?
Thanks, Molly. At the end of the day, we all agree that the one thing that everyone needs is safe, stable, affordable housing. We have been working together to build a shared understanding of our vision for success when it comes to coordinated entry, especially as it pertains to the inclusion of victim service providers in local communities, as well as serving survivors through either victim service provider entry points or homeless service provider entry points. And really the key thing is the client choice, coordination, and integration of program and support. So making sure that at the local level that victim service providers and housing service providers understand that at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is safe, stable, and affordable housing for all of our clients.
And I think starting with that shared goal that Sophia was outlining, what we can really identify is what can we each bring to the table in the way of expertise that fully accomplishes that goal of safe and stable, affordable housing. And I think for those of y'all who like to spend your free time reading the amazing resources from the Domestic Violence and Housing TA Consortium, as Alexandra and I'm sure Sophia and I like to do, this is directly in alignment with what HUD is asking, that victim service providers, domestic violence coalitions, CoCs be fully at the table together so that we can all look together at examining housing and homelessness. And this includes certainly those parties, but also local homeless coalitions when you're looking at the geographic area here in Texas. And I think we can all identify that when we share these goals, we combine all those expertise points. No one of us can be the expert at everything. So together, when you think about what domestic violence coalitions and victim service provider experts can bring, we are really well versed at supporting survivors of domestic violence and hearing directly their thoughts and concerns and bringing that to the table. And that CoCs and local homeless coalitions bring a wealth of expertise around housing and homelessness. And so you can see when we put that all together, it's only going to benefit survivors that we can truly be a joined expert group on supporting survivors and obtaining housing. For us, there's still obviously a lot of work to do. And in a moment, before we dive into that confidentiality standards, we identify that there are a lot of CoCs to work with. We've always enjoyed a really great partnership with the Balance of State and a couple other CoCs, but certainly we continue to want to work even more. And identifying those shared points is not always going to be enough. Over the past years, TCFV has worked on a number of efforts to collaborate and coordinate to support the goal of safe and stable, affordable housing for survivors. So first, just to be honest, we are quite a large policy team. We are lucky to have a large policy team. And that means there are 4 different staff members here who work on varying aspects of housing. So certainly today, Alexandra and I are here, but we also have great TCFV partners in Krista Delgado and Rona Murrow here who work on varying other areas of housing. For us, this means serving as advisory members on the Texas Interagency Council on Homelessness, and that's kind of the Texas version of USITCH. It means liaising with other CoCs, linking with HMIS leads to hopefully share in their expertise, running a comparable database and offering that support, as well as having communications from state entities as the quasi-HMIS lead because we are running the comparable database changes. We also find that we just really love to submit comments and that much great change happens at the regulatory level. And so we are often looking for public comment opportunities that will enhance survivor housing opportunities. Certainly CoCs are one amazing venue for housing, but we know that there are a number of other portals that, for example, the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, kind of the state's main housing entity here, and other partners have around housing access. And so we continue to look for those avenues to provide those comments and regulations that we believe will enhance survivors' access. We also, not just because we're on the webinar series, but mean it deeply, that we really have gotten so much support from the TA Housing Consortium and the Safe Housing Partnerships website. Often, if I think if there's a resource, it is there. And all of this is kind of just to say that the shared goals is an amazing framework to start with, but then the work starts, right? You can't just have those shared goals. You have to continually be collaborating and having those discussions to make it work on both sides.
Absolutely. I think, so we collaborate very much in the same ways that TCFV does, and I think great minds think alike, so that's probably why we have such a great relationship, Molly and Alexandra. So THN serves as an advisory member on the Texas Interagency Council on Homelessness, or the TICH as Molly described. Molly is a member of our board, which Molly is a great resource outside of being a board member, but also as a board member has really engaged in really robust discussions around prioritization or our assessment tool or whether or not to reallocate a housing project. So we really value her input at the CoC board level. We have one seat that's dedicated to victim service providers. As we've mentioned a couple of times, THN and TCFV have had a working relationship for many years. I tried to ask around the office to see how long we have been working in collaboration together, and the only thing people could say was a long time. THN is also a member of TCFV, so we get all of the newsletters and training opportunities that they send out to their members. We really try to, so our Texas Balance staff members have some familiarity of confidentiality and privacy as it pertains to survivors, since several of our CoC or Continuum of Care program funded agencies are victim service providers. So we really want everyone to be aware of the unique privacy and confidentiality concerns of survivors. And we try to make sure that that's included in everything that we send out. HN also leads the statewide conference on ending homelessness, where we have several presentations from individuals like Molly. I think, yeah, Molly, you're presenting this year. Molly or Krista Delgallo. So there's a lot of content specific to victim service providers, but also I think it lends well to our homeless service providers that come to the conference. And as I said before, many of our CoC program-funded projects and our ESG program-funded projects are operated by victim service providers. So because of that, we need to be on the up and up about the information that's available. And I want to echo what Molly said about the resources that are available. It's been very helpful as we've moved through coordinated entry to see everything that's been tailored to coordinated entry and survivors. So thank you all for creating those.
Yeah, so as we know, confidentiality is critical to survivor safety, but sometimes that can also appear to look like a roadblock to other system collaborators, including those CSCs that victim service providers are working with. So with VAWA and TIPSA confidentiality regulations, as well as our new Texas victim advocate privilege, it has been critical to explain the necessity of information privacy to our system partners and support survivors' choices over where their information will be captured and where it will be stored. So collaborating with other systems really requires those honest conversations about what privacy rights survivors hold, and that ultimate decision relating to where their information will lie is with the survivor and the survivor alone.
So we also know, with what Alex said in mind, from a practical standpoint, through our work, sharing goals is not always that easy when it comes to confidentiality. I think we can all uphold the idea around confidentiality, and certainly in victim services, we think about it at every step of the way and have worked with our partners too. But so much of the work of HUD is data-driven. So when confidentiality and safety is at play, how do we make sure survivors get represented? This occurs at the individual level around survivor access to housing, but also in the system performance measures, to be frank. Because victim service providers don't participate in HMIS, which is absolutely necessary for very real confidentiality and safety issues, system performance measures inherently, they're really thought about as a way to measure impact and progress towards meeting the needs of those experiencing homelessness, don't always fully tell the picture of what survivors need to meet around experiencing homelessness. And certainly we know there are workarounds that exist, but it has caused in some instances a perception that victim service providers and by proxy, unfortunately, survivors of domestic violence are not always represented. It's not a shared goal. It's not where I think we stand together in alignment, but it is a very real piece that has come up over the years. And so this may mean also that victim service providers are a bit more apprehensive about coordinated entry systems and the way in some communities it's linked in with HMIS, which means for us being able to completely be at the forefront of that discussion with the balance of state, because we know the minute HMIS is brought up, I think all of the amazing victim service providers are wanting to support survivor privacy. I think to compound this issue and kind of trying to solve housing, it's going to require access to a lot of different modalities. One of the things that's unique about survivors experiencing homelessness, and when we describe that or think about that category of homelessness, it's because of a victimization. It means that because this violence occurred in a survivor's life, they are now homeless. And so no one housing is going to fit everybody because it's not focused on the homeless event, it's focused on the victimization. So how do we keep at the top that we know survivors are safer when their privacy and confidentiality rights are upheld, and that I think together we share that goal when we also know more and more data is held in HMIS. And so I think that's a continuous discussion anytime the instance arrives. Alex talked about this a little bit, but just for us, we think it's critical to acknowledge that the issue is not inherently in the data itself, it's in what data is offered. So when you have a shared system, that is clearly an issue because it compromises safety and compromises confidentiality. So if we kind of set the data to the side for a minute, that's the core of the issue. We know HMIS leads and CoCs, frankly, they care a lot about data security. We hear often their concerns about data security. But for survivors of domestic violence, it's not about always data security, it's about data privacy and how many people can see that information in a community. And so victim service providers often understand absolutely that there's encryption, hashing, firewalls that HMIS programs are putting in place, but it's just not going to address the privacy and confidentiality issues around access to data. So for us, once we acknowledge that, we can move to the next step and focus on then what data can we offer? How can we participate to fully support survivors' access to housing? In Texas, for sure, as Alice mentioned, that includes TCFV taking on the role of staying up to date and running that comparable database, being aware of HMIS issues, even little pieces like audit trails and those things that are necessary. It also means working with victim service providers to have reports to be able to offer de-identified data within the local homeless coalitions and planning so that they can come to the table with data that promotes, protects, and supports confidentiality, but also allows communities to better plan for the needs of survivors. And so all of this is just to say that you can meet both those goals. You can offer data in a community to help do some system performance that is de-identified and allows systems to consider thinking about what survivors need and want in a community. And so with that, we're going to really shift into how we do that within coordinated entry.
Thanks, Molly. So coordinated entry, a great idea without all the pieces until 2017. Coordinated entry is a necessary ingredient in an effective housing crisis response system focused on making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So coordinated entry, or CE, is essentially the streamlining of access to housing and services for people experiencing a housing crisis. So when I started my career, I worked in Alameda County, and we were administering homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program funds, or HPRP funds. And when people would show up to our office, I'd determine if they were eligible for any of that assistance, and if they weren't, I'd have them some brochures and say, maybe you can try these agencies. And that's the way things were or are. I do think it has created a great touch point for me when I've traveled across the state to talk about what coordinated entry is not. So coordinated entry is not you show up, I see if you're available for what I have, and then I send you on your way if you're not eligible, but rather it's what do you need of the services that are available in our community or in our continuum of care, rather than these are the services that we will offer you. So the idea of coordinated entry is really meeting people where they are at. When I first started traveling to do orientation trainings for coordinated entry, I'd often say that we were trying to be like the victim service provider or the domestic violence world, and that we're meeting people where they are. We're offering the resources tailored to the needs that they have. We're being more trauma-informed and person-focused. Just a little bit of background about coordinated entry, because I also find that people think that HUD just, came up with it one day. So HUD found through the administration of the Rapid Rehousing for Families demonstration program and the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing program, as well as other best practices that they were seeing in communities in the late aughts or 2000s, they learned that a centralized or coordinated assessment system is important for ensuring the success of homeless assistance and homeless prevention programs in communities. So in particular, such assessment systems help communities systematically assess the needs of program participants and effectively match each individual or family with the most appropriate resources available to address that individual or family's particular needs. In 2011, HUD released the Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG program interim rule, where they mentioned centralized or coordinated assessment and said that if you receive ESG program funding, as soon as the Continuum of Care implements coordinated entry, you must participate. But it wasn't until 2012 with the CoC program interim rule, or the Continuum of Care program interim rule, that HUD established some baseline requirements for coordinated entry. And those were, one, it had to cover the geographic area. It had to be easily accessible. It had to be well advertised, so people needed to know about it, both people experiencing a housing crisis, but also people working in social services. And also it needed to include a comprehensive and standardized assessment tool. And again, at that point, it was called centralized or coordinated assessment. In 2005, HUD changed the name to coordinated entry. So I don't know if you guys, I do this in my spare time, read about systems in other counties or in other states, and they'll refer to it as coordinated assessment or coordinated access or coordinated entry. So just keep that in mind. I know we have people from all over the country, so it's different things all over. But in 2015, they released the coordinated entry policy brief, which gave us some more information about what was required for coordinated entry, but not a lot more. I think they really learned a lot from the communities that were those early innovators that really moved forward with the baseline guidance that was released in 2011 and 2012. But it wasn't until early last year, where they released notice CPD 1701, that is the notice establishing additional requirements for coordinated entry. So much more robust requirements around what your coordinated entry system or process needed to look like. And it also set a deadline for when systems, their policies and procedures needed to be tailored according to this new guidance. And that deadline was January 23rd, 2018. So if you experience a mad rush in your CoC early this year, that is why. So again, the basics of coordinated entry, and I wish I had put I have this illustration that I use every time I present on coordinated entry. Basically moving from this maze where we're asking people who are experiencing a crisis or several crises to navigate or shop for assistance. So it's moving away from that maze of a system to one that is more streamlined and easy to access. So they would just show up at one location or one of the coordinated locations and be assessed for what's available in the community. Just a little bit about coordinated entry in the TX BoS CoC. So we have developed an overarching framework, and we outlined it in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care Coordinated Entry Written Standards. We released those for public comment. Molly responded to them, which I really appreciate. Thank you again, Molly. So we did some tweaks to it, especially to the DV workaround, which we'll talk about later, a little bit later in the presentation. But we did some tweaks to the coordinated entry written standards, and then we released them formally, I believe, in June of last year. What we required, because we're such a large balance of state and because we needed to allow flexibility, because we have so many, so we have 17 communities that receive CoC or Emergency Solutions Grant funding, and they're all different when it comes to their housing resources, so what funded projects they do or do not have, whether or not they have an emergency shelter, all that. And so we needed to allow for a lot of flexibility. And so what happens is, just like with a lot of our work, we funneled the responsibility of developing policies and procedures for coordinated entry processes to the local level. So communities have what is called a coordinated entry planning entity who works in its, the coordinated entry planning entity consists of a variety of stakeholders in the community. It's open to anybody who wants to attend. But they are the entity responsible for planning for coordinated entry and then also assessing for the health of coordinated entry in the long run. So in terms of serving survivors, are we following the procedures as outlined in the written standards? Are we truly protecting the privacy and the confidentiality of survivors as they move through their system, et cetera? So, so like I said earlier, I started working here in 2013, so almost 5 years ago. And I'm really grateful that we had an established relationship with TCFV because very early on, I was able to reach out to Molly about, or it may have happened the other way around. It's a little foggy at this point, but Molly, if you know, you can chime in. So we worked on a domestic violence sexual assault pre-screen. So what we realized early on in the process is that a pre-screen is an important first step because we wanted to ensure that safety concerns would be addressed and help directed to survivors to specific services immediately without them having to go through a complete full assessment. The DVHTAC takes 10 minutes plus gathering the universal data elements. So we really wanted to make sure that we were being thoughtful and catching people at the beginning. And so we worked with TCFV and TASA on the pre-screen. And from what I've been seeing, it's been working really well. I've been running reports this week, and we're seeing the report for the housing count. So it's not tied to anybody. Just to clarify, it's not tied to anybody in HMIS. It just gathers a count. So, for example, I know in the month of May, a community referred 3 people to their local victim service provider. So it helps us have that communication with the local victim service provider about, have you seen people who have come through coordinated entry first? Also, a big piece of the pre-screen is that we encourage all of our housing providers to work to do a warm handoff with the victim service provider. So if they identify somebody who is fleeing domestic violence, they are instructed to contact the victim service provider and provide that warm handoff and try to arrange transportation as possible. And what I've found through my time in this position is that it's really just a continuation of current processes that happened. So when we talked about it with them or with the housing providers, it wasn't like a shocking new change to how they were working. Another thing, as I mentioned, is the balance of state coordinated entry written standards. Like I said, we had a public comment period where we received quite a bit of comments, one inclusive from Molly, which represents the voices of survivors and other people in the coalition. And then we also worked on the victim service provider or VSP HMIS workaround, aka the DV workaround, which we will be going into more detail about. But essentially, it's the de-identified way to get information into HMIS from a victim service provider. And we'll talk about like the mechanics of that in a little bit.
Yeah, and I think as Sophia was saying, if you remember kind of at the beginning when she was saying not every piece is immediately present, I think we were kind of constantly in collaboration trying to do the best at the time. And so that pre-screen, for example, with our partners in victim service providers and the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, a lot of time there was spent kind of trying to move away from questions we just know that are not effective, like, are you a victim of domestic violence? Or do you feel safe right now? And we kind of worked, how do we ask that question, knowing that maybe not everyone will have a lengthy background in victim services. So really trying to focus on, like, one, making it more like universal. So clarifying first, hey, I ask this question of everyone so that it doesn't feel like the survivor is getting a particular question. Kind of offering enough information, like some survivors may have safety concerns that are unique. Would you be interested in talking to the best expert? So I think that was an example where we were able to, at the time, put some of our heads together on working on the best piece at the time. And we do want to say we have been lucky to have really great collaboration. And for those of y'all on the call, I think if you're thinking about, like, if you haven't started working together in the past, because I think, like Sophia said, I know for as long as I've been here, and I've been here almost 12 years, we've had an amazing relationship. If you haven't, I think the first thing to do is to just start talking. I think part of what has always worked well between us is that we talk about little things and big things and just get to hear from each other really regularly so that when there is a potential challenge, or a disagreement that we're working through, the trust is already built, and it was built on small interactions rather than stepping in on a big issue. And I think part of it for us too is just trusting that we do have expertise points to bring and really wanting, for example, to hear what Sophia is sharing. And you'll see here where we have had, we call them disagreements, but just maybe where we didn't come to the exact same place. And I think part of that, for example, has been around the FBI SPDAT and the VI SPDAT. We had heard from some programs that they would have probably preferred a different tool. And I think part of that is just questions around, does that tool fully get to vulnerabilities for survivors? And I think that that was a great time for us to hear the Balance of State's perspective and Sophia's perspective, and agreed for, at the time, to disagree and say, okay, it's in your expertise at the Balance of State. Y'all are choosing to use this. We do want to hear that and see how it works and just listen. And I think that was just a great time that trust was already built to hear that from Sophia. And I think there's been other times, for example, where we've been able to raise our concerns around things like prioritization. If we're thinking about how to prioritize housing, what are those elements? And if there's times where there's kind of a piece that maybe unintentionally didn't fully raise up survivors as a priority, we've been able to have really good dialogue with the Balance of State folks about, hey, y'all may not have immediately seen this, but if we prioritize those two factors, many survivors won't be that. And kind of making changes when possible and agreeing to disagree when we don't always have that in place. Do you want to add anything else here, Sophia?
Yeah, I think an important piece to this too is that we're always willing to say that we'll keep looking at it, right? So this is the beginning point, and let's see if that works and let's move forward with the data or what we're seeing across the country and stuff like that. I think the other thing is it's been really helpful to come into these conversations with both sides having at least some of the same language. So I'm not an expert in serving survivors at all, but I try to read as much as I can so that I can go in and have an informed conversation with Molly or Alexandra. And I think because they focus on housing policy, it's been easy to have these conversations and understand that we're all coming from the same place, which is that we fundamentally believe that everybody should have access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. So to what we've been promising for a little bit. So the mechanics of coordinated entry. So again, because the Balance of State is so large, the configuration of how survivors are served looks a little bit different. So in some communities, we have the victim service providers that are not participating in coordinated entry. We try to continue to do outreach and engagement, and there's a variety of reasons why people do not want to participate, and that's okay. We just really try to work around that while still trying to engage them. So if the victim service provider is not an entry point, which is what we prefer that they be an entry point, we have the pre-screen. So if the survivor does not want to go through coordinated entry at a housing provider, they can get referred to the victim service provider to have their immediate concerns addressed. And then when housing is part of the case plan, then they can come back to the housing provider to work with them on coordinated entry. We also, and as this says, we also encourage survivor choice. So that also means that our assessors need to be trained and prepared to discuss all the nuances about sharing an HMIS. What are potential safety concerns? What is the release of information? Why is it important? What does sharing your information mean? So that's something that we've really beefed up in the last year, is how we train everybody in the Balance of State, all HMIS users, on how they explain the release of information and the HMIS safety issues. And then additionally, the community must have policies for serving survivors of domestic violence, and that's all built out in our template for local communities. So it needs to be, their care needs to be trauma informed. They need to make sure, again, that they're discussing the safety and confidentiality concerns of survivors, and they're working with them in as flexible a way as possible. Oh, and also something important to mention is that a household can, if they're going through coordinated entry at a housing provider, but don't want to share their information, but don't want their personal identifying information shared in HMIS, but are willing to go into HMIS, we have also instructed assessors that they can use the DV workaround to enter people in that way. So that de-identifies their information and allows them to be shared in HMIS.
So I think we want to also just give a little more detail on when a victim service provider is an entry point. And I think the overview of that function of by name list and importance of survivor access is critical. But if they are participating as an entry point and HMIS is a factor, how do survivors safely participate? And that's where that term DV workaround has come from. I know when it first was being kind of used, I was like, tell me more about that. And I think there are a number of instances where victim service providers may be in the point of entry into the balance of state coordinated entry system. And in those cases, that is the big question, like how do we access the full breadth of housing resources available in a community without ever violating confidentiality and safety? And so that's where the DV workaround got employed via the written standard, and it's where we offered a lot of commentary. I don't think the word workaround fully conveys it, but the idea that everyone should have full access to every housing resource in a COC. But to get there, if that by name list or master list is going to be in HMIS, then it's critical that there be a workaround.
So what you're looking at now is the original list of data elements that we wanted to enter into HMIS through the domestic violence workaround. So what that means and the way that works in the balance of state is that if a victim service provider is an entry point, as a community, they have to identify an HMIS using agency that will basically serve as their conduit to HMIS and provide the de-identified information that we landed on, which we'll show you in a little bit. And this is very much based on the information that we had available through Connecticut and also through the Utah Balance of State Continuum of Care. It's very much what we landed on is very much reminiscent of that information. So this is the original list that we had proposed in our first version of the written standards. And Molly and I think, went back and forth for like a year on this, not this specifically, but about the DV workaround, and for several months on the data elements. And I think it was really valuable conversation because I did learn a lot about what is considered. I thought I knew a little bit about it, but what is considered PPI, even if you're not collecting like social security numbers and names. Molly, did you want to take perspective and the guidance that you had gotten on those data elements?
Yeah, and I think like Sophia was saying at TCFV when these came out, we had kind of mixed initial reactions because we were, of course, excited to see that the balance of state had already started that consideration of survivors. So I think as representing victim service providers of coalition, we're always excited to see that and that they were really thinking about how do we get full access to housing. On the other hand, for those of you on the call who are victim service providers, you will probably identify a number of these elements that we knew would violate VAWA and SIPSA provisions. And I think it does hinge on what Sophia was saying about who is defining personally identifying information or PII. For us, items like race, gender, those were immediately identifiable. But there were other things like where did you stay the night before that also to us were. Like if you think about a situation where a survivor is in a rural community and there's one church in town and they said, I stayed at XYZ church, we've gotten to that identifiable. I think it was the shared history that allowed us to have that great communication. That's why we can't emphasize enough that it's kind of like when you're working with legislators, the best time to talk to them is before you have anything you need to talk to them about. And I think with any system partner, that's true, so y'all can get to know each other. This was absolutely a long road, and that is because of what I say is PII and what Alex said was PII and what Val says is PII. May differ from, for example, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act standards. So we had to all come together on PII. And for us, just to be very frank, we had to come together to stand very strong with the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, because at the coalition level, we often train about those provisions. So it's just really important to make sure those were working for survivors. And I think we always felt that the balance of state was hearing that it was about those nuances to fully get there on that long road together. And I think it did feel like we were on it together, which was the nice part. It felt like we knew we would come to something. And so above, you're going to see the final elements that are now comprising the data elements for domestic violence work around the balance of state. So we were really able to take out the PII, personally identifying information measures, and think about what's de-identified. In just a second, Sophia's going to talk to you about that de-identified first and last name, but you'll see the next piece is veteran status. That's probably for folks on the call for obvious reasons, for specialized housing that the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing or VASH program might have. Next, you're going to see that VI spit out or FBI spit out score only. In connection with getting really good information from the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Confidentiality Institute, we were able to determine that offering the number of folks in a family would potentially be identifying, but offering the number of bedrooms needed would not. And so you'll see that on the screen. The only contact number is going to be that of the advocate. And then, Sophia, do you want to add about referrals and unmet needs and then give them the conventions on the de-identified first and last name?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the referral piece, it's really it's a functionality through HMIS that basically said this de-identified individual, we've assessed them through coordinated entry and they've been determined eligible for your housing intervention. So let's say it's rapid rehousing. So I would make a referral through HMIS to the rapid rehousing provider, and then they, at a later date when they have availability, would contact the advocate because that's the phone number that's available to them. And then with unmet needs, it's really just a tally of basically ways in which you could not serve the household. So, you know, I went through coordinated entry. They needed rapid rehousing, but this rapid rehousing program only targets chronically homeless individuals, and this household is not. So they have a rapid rehousing unmet need. So this is a really great way, and another data point that we're using in communities to show that we have this many people that need this resource, but we do not have it. When it comes to our de-identification, actually came from the Utah Balance of State Continuum of Care. So the way that it works is that with the first name, it's the last two digits of the year. So for example, when I'm pulling reports, I can see that there were people assessed in 2018. And then they have a unique 4-digit number without a space. So that number is assigned to them by us. So when communities are going through when communities are, excuse me, sorry, I was looking at the chat. When communities are going through and providing us with their policies and procedures, once they get approved, we provide them with their unique 4-digit number. And that's allowing us to identify, like, is this individual coming from a specific location without, like, being super obvious about that. And then, yeah, sorry, and that's the last name, excuse me, that's the number assigned by the Balance of State. So, sorry, guys. So the first name is actually 2 digits of the year, a hyphen, and then a unique 4-digit number. So they'll know on their end how many people they've already gone through. They have, the victim service provider has just like a Word document that says this is the de-identified name for this individual, and then the housing provider that enters the information into HMIS will provide them with the HMIS ID number so they know who it is. It's a running list. And then the last name is a number assigned by the Balance of State, and we provide that when they are getting their policies and procedures approved. Sorry. So another thing that we really wanted to make sure happened when working with survivors is that even for the de-identified elements, we want to make sure that the release of information, including the HMIS concerns that they need to have are discussed. We think that due diligence is important. They're probably going to encounter the ROI and HMIS in different instances, and so we think that it just makes sense to provide them with that information. We also tell victim service providers to, so coordinated entry is not the first thing that happens when somebody shows up to a victim service provider. That's an entry point. Again, the advice that we tell them is wait until housing is the concern that they have. And so we encourage them to do the assessment. Once that time has come, we encourage them to do that assessment on paper, and only the score is shared with HMIS. The victim service provider, so the advocate's phone number is listed in the contact information, and so what will happen is that the housing provider that's providing rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing will contact the victim service provider, and then the victim service provider will make that warm handoff of the individual. So they'll contact the household, ask if it's okay to provide that information or their new phone number, and provide that warm handoff to the housing provider. Is there anything else you want to add, Molly?
I just think one of the great things to highlight here is that through that long road, we were able to even move beyond kind of the baseline of what's necessary and think even further. So I like what Sophia was saying earlier about even when a survivor presents at a non-victim service provider entry point, that there are additional measures, and that even with these de-identified elements, a release of information is still discussed with the survivor around HMIS, which means the next time a survivor is interacting with another system, they will also have more information about HMIS. So I think we started at one place and just continue to say, how can we be even better, which I think is such a great place to be. And I think with that, I know we only have a couple minutes left. Do you want to give us an example, Sophia, about how it's working now?
Yeah, so I reached out to a community that's one of our highest performers and asked them how the workaround was working, and they said it's working really great. The local victim service provider contacts the agency. They're actually a food pantry that utilizes HMIS. They get everything in within 24 hours. And I ran reports last week and was able to find de-identified individuals showing up on the reports, which is really cool to see. So we find that it's working really well, and we're looking forward to digging into that a little bit more at the local level, because the information that we had gotten was from the United Way, who's leading the effort in that community. So as we mentioned, sorry.
No, please go ahead, Sophia.
So as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that we have to do. Molly, actually, as I was preparing for this presentation, I have 5 more things added to this list. But one of the things that I fundamentally agree with, and I've seen in all of the information that has been put out by the different think tanks, is how important cross-training of assessors is. And so that's something that's on our wish list, to partner with TCFV to train assessors on the needs of survivors, on domestic violence, on trauma-informed care, especially when it comes to serving survivors. So that's a really big thing that we hope to work on in the next year. Another thing is the desire to get chronic homelessness as a data element on the DV workaround. There's a lot of housing geared toward that specific subpopulation, so that would be something helpful to put on there. Another thing that we've talked about, especially as we were writing out the written standards in our back and forth, was how important shared messaging is in this work. And so I know we had talked about doing that like after the written standards were released, and that hasn't happened. So I'm looking forward to just providing more resources for victim survivors, victim service providers in the balance of state from both TCFV and ourselves.
Yeah, and I think just kind of to echo what Sophia is saying, and by way of wrapping up so we can turn it over for a couple other pieces, one of the things we've done is to make sure to have joint communication when there's a question. So either I will go directly to the Balance of State and Sophia, or we might get on a call together so that folks aren't feeling like they're hearing different messages from each group. So kind of standing together on those pieces. Like Sophia mentioned, training assessors is critical, and we have a great hope for doing that in the future. And then the potential placement of just a score field, so it wouldn't be, we definitely, from a victim service provider, would not put the VI SPDAT fully in the comparable database, but just a place that said assessment score that might make it a little bit easier for victim service providers. And again, I think so that we can move on to the next piece, I want to say we definitely have some lessons learned, and what's one of the great things is we just keep learning from each other and learning from all the work we're doing and learning from programs. And I think one of the big lessons and takeaways that we need to always assume the best intentions from each other. That anytime we see something that we know that it came from our best work, and that together it will only get better with our shared goals. And then I think to make sure that we always think that instead of thinking it might initially look like a challenge, to look at it like yet another opportunity to learn from each other about what we each do best. And then in the future, I know we would love to look even more at enlisting our great partners in sexual assault so that we have a more holistic perspective, because we are a standalone domestic violence coalition. And I think for any of you who've ever engaged in policy or systems work, we just have to keep remembering that really supportive true change takes time, and it's worth the time to support survivors to do that. Sophia, do you want to add anything, or should we turn it over to our other great partners on the call?
My lessons were very much the same, so maybe we should turn it over.
And we thank y'all for giving us a little bit of extra time.
Hi, everyone. So thank you all so much. That was so fantastic. I'm going to take 1 minute to just do our brief spiel so that we could get into Q&A. We have about 8 minutes left, so we want to get there quickly. If you want to learn more about the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, or you're looking for resources or information, we have a lot. You can find it on safehousingpartnerships.org. We also just want to flag for you, based on some of what was talked about today, we have some FAQs and practice guides for all of you out there that we think are valuable resources. And again, they can be found at Safe Housing Partnerships. So I'm going to go ahead and get to the questions. If we don't get to your question today, please contact us through safehousingpartnerships.org and or contact the presenters directly. We really want to get to those questions, but we only have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So the first question actually is pulled from a couple of questions. So I'm going to start with that. Regarding the DV workaround, does this then require a higher prioritization for DV survivors within coordinated entry? VI SPDAT aside, are DV survivors therefore prioritized higher in your CoCs when a DV agency is the referring agency? And then a second question, but it's linked in, is how do you ensure all providers within the CoC are adequately trained to understand client safety, confidentiality, choice, dynamics of DV, etc., onboarding, ongoing training, policy directives? So it's lumped in there together, but I think it all directly links. So whoever wants to tackle that from Texas, it's all yours.
I can take that. Is there a way that I can expand the Q&A a little bit so I can read that question? To make sure I'm answering all of it?
At the bottom of your screen. Yeah, if you go to the bottom of your screen, can you scroll to it?
Oh, I see. Okay, yep, thanks. Okay. So with prioritization, as Molly and I said earlier, we had a lot of discussion about prioritization, and that was very much an agree to disagree moment. A lot of our focus is on chronically homeless individuals and those that are unsheltered. However, we are in the process of revisiting that, both due to the VAWA compliance that is that is necessary in regards to the emergency transfer plans, but also just thinking about ending family homelessness in general. 50% of families identify domestic violence as the reason for becoming homeless. So we're at the point where we are revisiting the initial prioritization that we had set as a CoC. And then when it comes to ensuring how all providers within the CoC are adequately trained, that's something that we constantly struggle with. All of our training is done virtually due to how large our balance of state is. So we really try to weave in a lot of these things into different trainings that are conducted, because we have found that repetition really is key. But when it comes to the dynamics of domestic violence, to safety planning, that's definitely an area where we are looking forward to partnering with TCFV to make sure that we provide more robust training in the future.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Sophia said, some of what we've been doing is, and in partnership, is we present every year at their conference, and in particular, in each one of those trainings is a portion on coordinated entry and safety. So I think there has been absolutely some exposure to that training, but obviously thinking about this, a state this size, how do we maximize that exposure? But for us, that while we always love to be at that amazing conference, that certainly was part of it, with making sure that's infused in those trainings. So there has been some level of access, and much like Sophia, continuing to raise up prioritization, and I think it is, as Sophia said, a continuing evolving, looking at all of those pieces, and so we're excited to look towards the future of a way in which we can prioritize survivors.
Thank you. So then, as a question that I actually think coincides nicely with the first one, how are you now addressing pre-screening, detecting hidden DV, sexual violence, and the chronically homeless and LGBT communities, and how are the needs within the LGBT community addressed? I know it's a big one. I hear y'all, the wheels are turning like,
yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of clarification, right, in the different systems and the way in which that happens, and a victim service provider is going to look really different, because we've done an extensive, and I think so has CoCs from HUD directives, but we, of course, starting in 2014 and 2013, did quite a bit of work under the Family Violence Prevention and Service that not only asked you to create a policy in conjunction with our LGBTQ stakeholders around Texas, but also that you needed to make sure that everyone was aware of that and think through how to do those screenings. So on the victim service provider end, that has looked like we convened a stakeholder group of folks with expertise or identifying with the LGBTQ community to advise on policies. We meet yearly to continue to look at how we can do better at accessibility and screening. We're launching a large-scale research project this year, and a component of that is looking at how have we promoted access, how can we look exactly as I think the question was around when it may need some additional assessment and screening, and learning directly from community experts and stakeholders. So for us, it has been a multi-year process, including, like I said, developing policies, tools. We have client-side forms around all of these pieces. So I don't want to ever paint we're nowhere near where we need to fully be. But for us, we're about 4 years into an initiative here in Texas to continue to look at that, starting at the minute a hotline call is received, but even moving beyond that and saying, if we're really talking about accessibility, it means working with amazing stakeholders and groups and communities, and really actually infusing primary prevention into that model. So at the coalition level, it's a project that sits across our primary prevention team and our policy team, interestingly, because we look at it from a range of prevention, awareness, all the way to policy and systemic change at programs. I'm not sure that fully gets to it, but for us, it's a pretty holistic angle at the coalition.
Thanks, Molly. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, so we have 1 minute left. Still have a couple of questions. A couple of them were actually related to HMIS and comparable database. So what I'd like to suggest, and a few of you had, there was another question about rapid rehousing. What I'd like to suggest that if you had other questions that came up, because we weren't able to get to them, to definitely reach out through safehousingpartnerships.org or reach out directly to our presenters. So I want to thank everyone so much for taking the time today, for being here. Texas, shout out to you all and the great work you're doing there. This is not the end of our series. We are going to be launching another series, Take Two, at some point in the next couple of months. We have to figure out when. And we still have one more community that we're spotlighting. We're focusing on rural communities, and that's going to be in July. If you want more information, our contact information is right there up on the screen. You can email us directly as well. Thank you all so much, and thank you also to NRCDV for letting us all use your platform. We appreciate it. So thanks, everyone. You all have been great. Very, very fabulous. Thank you so much. And fill out that evaluation. We'll be sending that along with the PowerPoint and slides, the PowerPoint slides and the video and all the other good stuff. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.